Hi everybody, it's 314 Reactor here. Last week we looked at 3DMark 2006 and today we are looking at 3DMark Vantage, which is the first DirectX 10 benchmark that FutureMark made for Windows Vista. It has some brand new tests as well as new AI tests, Physx tests and feature tests. Again, this can be downloaded from the ul.com legacy benchmarks link that will be in the description. I'll also give you the code to unlock the full edition. The code can also be used to unlock 3DMark Vantage full edition on Steam if you purchase 3DMark Vantage while it's still available. It no longer is, but if you had it in the past, then you'll be able to still download it and unlock it. Otherwise, you can just download the full edition from here. I found that the one I was downloading from here was having some weird compatibility issues on Windows 11 on my current hardware, which is a Ryzen 7700X RTX 4090 and 32GB of VRAM, but the Steam ones seem to be a little bit more happy with operating with this newer software and hardware, so that is the one I'll be looking at today. Again, we also have the white paper for this, which seems to be quite stripped down and only has about 17 pages compared to the previous ones, which had about 30 odd pages. This is reflective of the fact that 3DMark Vantage is a little bit stripped down in some ways in that it doesn't have a demo. You'll have noticed that the initial intro we've seen there wasn't actually the demo, it was just a full benchmark running, so there's no sounds or music or anything like that. Like the previous ones, it's just purely the benchmark for whatever reason. The demo's returned in 3DMark 11 going forward, which we'll look at next week. But we can still look at all of the new cool DirectX 10 features. This was released in 2008, well into the era of DirectX 10 and Shader Model 4, and so it has a brand new 3D engine architecture, including rendering of simulation inputs, depth views, shadow map generation, pre-depth of appropriate materials, speed optimization, opaque illumination, with possible hierarchical rendering steps, reflection and refraction, translucent, illumination, and post-processing. So there's a whole load of information here about generating the shadow maps and the GPU simulation, translucent illumination, stuff like that, all available to read. Again, all these links will be down in the description. This one, again, uses high dynamic range using 16-bit per component floating point render targets, so it's going to have that same sort of look as 3DMark 2006. This is where the shaders become a lot more advanced. So you've got material shaders, light shaders, transformation shaders. Material shaders describe how the surface reflects and emits light. Light shaders describe how light from light sources reaches the material surface, and transformation shaders perform vertex transformation. So we're heading to a lot more of an advanced pipeline here, probably the early days of moving towards PBR. I think we have the similar sort of shadows that were seen in 3DMark 2006, but probably far more advanced to make sure that the shadows look very, very good, as this is kind of the era where shadows, influenced by kind of Doom 3 and Fear, stuff like that, needed to become a lot more natural looking, a lot more advanced and dynamic. So having the old sort of blocky shadows was kind of going out of fashion then. They were kind of trying to blend to make sure that the blocky shadows weren't there anymore, but also trying to maintain the dynamicism of shadows, but without the ridiculously harsh stencil shadows as seen in the aforementioned Doom 3 and Fear. There's some post-processing effects here: bloom, streaks, anamorphic flare, lens flare, lenticular halo, depth of field, motion blur, depth fog, film grain noise, volumetric fog, and tone mapping with gamma correction and vignette. And there's some extra details on those post-processing effects here. So this is going to have a very 2008 look to it, which is fantastic. That's exactly what we want going down this nostalgia trip. So it looks like there's some GPU physics simulations here, as well as some detail on that. Extra details on the anti-aliasing, which is still using MSAA. All the basic other options here. And then we move into the information about the graphics tests. So we have Jane Nash, Calico as the main two tests, and then there are feature tests underneath that, which again shows how kind of stripped down this is, as previous FutureMarks had 2 or 3 or sometimes even 4 main graphical tests. So it's a bit of a shame to see here. 2008 maybe to do with the economic crisis perhaps impacting the development, not sure. Here we go. Both graphics tests use the same post-processing effects outlined in section 3.3. Both include the GPU simulated particle systems, and the particle systems are implemented as GPU vertex simulations with simple vertex integration, gravity, and air resistance. So we're getting some really cool stuff here where the particles are being processed on the GPU, which means you can have a lot more detail on them. I believe this is where we are using Physx on the GPU as well. So here we have some details on the Jane Nash scene. I'm not going to go too far into the text here. Calico, so basically you've got a large indoor game scene with water and some sort of shooting mechanics, and then you've got a space flight one in Calico with lots and lots of planets and asteroids and ships flying around. And then you go into the CPU tests, which is similar to the previous CPU tests in that the post-processing effects are switched off, no complex shader used, no shadows used, simplified geometry is used, and the world outside the camera view is not modeled, and I believe it's at low resolution as well, but as much load on the CPU as possible. There's also an AI test here as well that consists of a Canyon airplane race course. So there's pathfinding there, where each plane has to follow the gates in order, approximates a physical flight model for fixed-wing aircraft, and avoids collision with other planes. There's some more details here about that, but generally the idea is to put as much pressure on the CPU as possible, and it does appear to be one thread per core, so it should scale up even on relatively modern systems. And we have Physx tests, CPU test 2, which again uses the Ageia Physx library to simulate a complex game world with large amounts of physical content, and the Physx library also allows for an Ageia Physx processor. So this is the one where, even though it's a CPU test, if you have a PPU, it will leverage that. Now, from my experience, when I've tried to run with the PPU as an option on, it crashes out because I believe the Physx software currently in NVIDIA drivers probably doesn't support the old PPU instructions from this, so this will be running on the CPU in my tests. Although it would be cool to one day get an old Ageia Physx card and install it in an old 2006 to 2008 era system and actually try this test on the hardware itself. I thought it may run on a modern NVIDIA card. As we know, Ageia were purchased by NVIDIA in 2008, and they continue to work on some of their SDKs, but the actual hardware acceleration was moved onto the GeForce graphics cards, and eventually the support for the PPUs was dropped. So I'll put a link in the description to this Wikipedia page as well as some other information about Ageia, but that's probably why when you enable PPU processing on this benchmark, it crashes out. So essentially it's a large physics test consisting again of a number of airplanes all trying to fly through a set of air race gates at the same time, which results in a large number of collisions and breakages. Planes are comprised of 12 rigid body pieces held together by 11 breakable joints, and the breakup on collision is unscripted and driven by Physx simulation. And there's also smoke, which is also simulated by a fluid simulation system available in Physx, and the smoke slowly dissipates over time. So when a PPU is not present, there's one pair of gates assigned to the game world for each CPU core. When a PPU is available, there is one pair of gates in the game world for each CPU core, minus one, and 4 additional pair of gates to be simulated on the PPU. So depending on the number of cores and whether a PPU is installed, there can be a shared load between the CPU and the PPU, which makes sense. And there's also some stuff simulated on the PPU, except for the rigid body simulations, which run on the CPU. So it still is a CPU test, which is good because that makes sense. Although I would have preferred an individual Ageia Physx test. Maybe there is one of those that exists. I might have to try and dig one of those out. But again, it may not even run on modern hardware. And then we have the standard feature tests, texture fill rate, color fill rate, parallax occlusion mapping shader test, which is we have a 4K by 4K height map representing a hilly landscape that's mapped on a quad and rendered with 4 point lights and 3 directional lights in a single pass with POM self-shadowing for each light. So that's similar technology that I've started to use in Crysis, where you can really get some details on the textures in a game without actually having physical geometry there. There's also a cloth simulation test that's being simulated on the GPU, which is done in vertex and geometry shaders. Because of course now we've reached DirectX 10 and shader model 4, we now not only have pixel and vertex shaders shared across the unified shaders that existed on the GeForce 8 series, but you now have geometry shaders. So geometry shader is a shader program written in a high-level shader language that governs the processing of primitives. They sit between the vertex shaders and the fixed function vertex post-processing stage. And of course, by this point, shaders had become pretty much synonymous with GPU programs. Originally, obviously, a pixel shader was meant to determine the shade of the pixel or the color of the pixel, but by this point, shader had just become a term for a program that runs on a GPU core. So essentially what they do is they take in a number of vertex points, and instead of a vertex shader which takes every vertex individually and processes them and applies a transformation, it can take multiple vertices in at once and perform different operations on them. I found a really good video that helps describe this. It's given me a quick crash course on this. Obviously, I'm still very, very basic on this, so I'll redirect you to the video in the description, which will come under the header info on geometry shaders, which will give you a much more fully fledged lecture on geometry shaders. Also, I found some additional information here on gamedev.stackexchange that says geometry shaders have essentially been deprecated due to their low performance. They could have been used for level of detail subdivision of geometry, but their performance wasn't so good, and it looks like they've been replaced with mesh shaders and possibly tessellation shaders, which hopefully we will look at in the future as we look at more modern benchmarks and graphic systems. So again, all links for that will be in the description to go over geometry shaders. But moving on, let's take a look at the presets. So there are 4 presets available. There's entry, performance, high, and extreme, which seems very much reminiscent of Crysis's graphics settings, which makes sense because that was very much in vogue at the time. And the entry preset is targeted for integrated and low-end hardware with 128 megabytes of graphics memory, and the higher preset requires 512 megabytes of graphics memory. 512 megabytes of memory on the higher end is pretty funny nowadays, given that we have graphics cards with 24 gigabytes of VRAM, and that will probably increase very soon. Quite quaint nowadays. You see we've got the options here. You got resolutions, multi-sample count for anti-aliasing, quality, texture filtering, max anisotropy, texture quality, shadow resolution quality, POM shader quality, volumetric quality, post-processing quality, and post-processing disable option. The interesting one is the post-processing scale. I don't know what this means. 1 to 5, 1 to 2, 1 to 2, 1 to 5. On the entry level it says 1 to 5, then it goes down on performance and down on high to 1 2, and it goes back up on extreme to 1 5. So I'm not 100% sure what that means. So at first I would have assumed that the higher the second number would have been better, but it says here, information I can really find about it is the scale of post-processing effects relative to screen resolution. So I'm guessing it's 1 pixel of data to 8 pixels on post-processing, which means I'm guessing the higher that second number, the worse the quality, which is bizarre that it goes back up to 1 to 5 on extreme preset. See, the other confusing thing is that if you look at multi-sample count here, the higher, better quality is lower down in the menu, but over here, the higher, better quality is higher up in the menu. So I don't know whether this is higher or lower or better, what's worse here. It's really hard to tell, but what I'm going to do is chuck it to 1 to 2 and hope for the best on that one. I think it's probably an error that extreme goes up to 1.5, whereas entry was on 1.5. It would make more sense that it would go 1.5, 1.2, 1.2, 1.2. So I'm going to leave it on 1.2 for my tests. Anyway, moving on. There's just some information about how the scoring is done here, and then some information about the product editions. So again, that white paper will be linked in the description. So as mentioned, I'm using the Steam version, but you can also install the EXE version just fine, although I did have a couple of odd problems with it, that it kept saying an instance of 3DMark Vantage was already running, even on fresh boot. No idea why, but that didn't happen to me the first time I ran it, but it started happening to me randomly later on. I tried messing around with various other settings of compatibility, but I couldn't find out what was happening. I also couldn't find anything on VOGONS, so it may have just been a weird thing with my operating system or something I did wrong. Either way, we're going to be looking at the Steam version, and you can see the UI here is about as 2008 as you can get. So you've got the graphical tests here, the CPU tests selected here, presets. You can go into the options here, which is slightly toned down. Again, kind of reminiscent of everything with Vantage. Everything is sort of stripped down a little bit. There's not so many options. There's not options to turn off or on double floating point precision and stuff like that. It's just your bare bones settings, which is fine. And then you've got the ability to disable post-processing. You can disable GPU simulations, and you can also disable the PPU or enable the PPU. We have it disabled because, as said, when having that enabled, it crashes out on the tests. So everything's extreme, everything's at 4K, high as it goes so we can get the best experience. Nash and new Calico enabled. We have the CPU tests, AI tests, and Physx tests enabled, and we have the texture fill, color fill, POM, Perlin noise, GPU particles, and GPU cloth feature tests enabled as well. Here we have the system info. It's no longer within the UI. Now you click it and it brings up an XML, which I found brings up a blank XML for me now, so that no longer works, which is ironic because the older versions, 3DMark 2005 and 2006, worked perfectly fine within the application to show exactly what CPU and GPU is running. So again, another oddity there. I've got the results page, which again has the online results browser. For some reason on my last run, it's got a GPU score, CPU score, but it hasn't calculated the overall 3DMark score for some reason, and it also gives you some extra details here about each individual test. Of course, there's the upgrade option here, which we've already upgraded to the max version, and the about page, because there's no demo, now has the credits on the right hand side. That's all set up. What we're going to do is we're going to run 3DMark and we're going to have a look at the tests as they go. Again, I've got the white paper here, so we have to look through some of these. Now, while we're loading Nash, you can see the Physx, NTech, and DirectX 10 logos at the bottom there. And you'll also see at the top, it will say creating shaders in a minute. So I believe this is the kind of early days of shader compilation. The first thing you'll notice is there's some graphical artifacting here. I don't think that's a hardware issue. I think that's more of a software issue with the drivers being incompatible. It only happens on this test as far as I've seen. And you'll see some other oddities as well, like strange looking specular mapping. Some of the post-processing looks a bit off here as well. But yeah, there's lots of weird lighting, texture flashing, all sorts of other weird things going on here. Not sure what causes it, but I imagine it's a bug in the drivers that's incompatible with something very specific on this. I could probably record it and send a bug to NVIDIA, and they might fix it in their drivers, but I doubt it because it's such an old benchmark. And I don't really generally see any graphical glitches in any of the other benchmarks or even any other games from this era. So this test has lots of static objects, lots of complex dynamic skinned objects, lots of shadow mapping, no ray marching volumetric effects, cloth simulation, anisotropic materials, math heavy, water caustics, and hierarchical rendering passes to render water reflection and refraction. So I imagine it's all the extra rendering passes that could be causing some sort of incompatibility here and causing the strange flashing. But you can see the cool cloth physics there, you can see the cool water physics there. And back in the day, this would just absolutely wreck cards of the time. I remember I had a 7900 GT that would not work very well with this, and even my 8600 GT that I got a couple of years later really struggled with this. Even my 9800 GT I got in 2009 struggle with this. But you'd also see some strange issues in the water there as well, like some of the physics didn't look quite right. So yeah, I think there's, again, like I say, there's just some driver issues there with how old the game engine is. And here we move on to new Calico, which is where there are no graphical issues as far as I've seen. It runs pretty flawlessly and it looks amazing. So this one ages a lot better because there's no human rendering in it, and when you're trying to render humans, it's really hard to capture that, and especially on older game engines, it does not age very well. Whereas this still looks pretty phenomenal. It's a planet that looks like Coruscant in the background there from Star Wars. And here we go, the big ship incoming. Kind of like the Sulaco from Aliens. Looks absolutely incredible. And would have been very much influenced by the recent Star Wars movies. I think the most recent one at the time was Revenge of the Sith. And yeah, you can tell this looks so good. I love this one. Back in the day, this ran at single digits. Even now, it's running at 60 FPS. Which, yeah, you'd expect it to run a lot faster on a 4090 modern hardware, but I'm guessing it's limitations of DirectX 10, the older software, and it's just a hell of a test. God, it looks good. All the post-processing looks a little bit off in some places. I don't know if that's an incompatibility or it's just the post-processing of the time, because it doesn't look quite right. I think it may just be the post-processing of the time. But damn if that doesn't look amazing. I just realised it looks like that ship just wiped out an entire continent on that planet. My God. Never really noticed that before. I always thought it was an explosion in space, but it's not, is it? It's taking out the planet. Wow. Very cool. Sort of bug-like design on the little ships there. Kind of reminiscent of Lex, but also kind of Quake 2 design to it. And those are the two main graphical tests done. There was lots of moving objects on that, of course. And there's also some local and global ray tracing effects, parallax occlusion mapping, and volumetric fog. So there was actually some sort of ray tracing on that, but very limited edition of it, which is really fascinating to see. It could explain the low frame rate. And now we're on to the CPU test. Oh, and yeah, it's crashed out with a runtime error. That's interesting. So yeah, it appears that this version of 3DMark is the most unstable as far as I've had. The other ones all ran reasonably well once you'd patched them up, but I've even ran this on some older hardware and it tends to crash that as well, even with a blue screen on one of my laptops. This is very strange. Interestingly, it ran the CPU test number 1, which ran fine, which was just the one where the planes are navigating through and the CPU is calculating the navigation, and it crashed on the second one, which uses the Ageia Physx library, which is where I've seen crashes before on this. I thought disabling the PPU option would have enabled that to run through, but it didn't. It crashed out rather nastily. Interestingly, the video footage you've seen at the start of this video was recorded from the installer version from the UL website version of 3DMark Vantage, and that ran fine with the PPU disabled. When I enabled PPU, then it would crash, but with a different error than that. But the Steam version is now crashing in a very different way, so I'm going to try and run that again, and hopefully it works this time. Of all the 3DMarks I've used, this one is the most bizarrely unstable, and all sorts of weird things happen with it. So there's the AI test. Let's see if we can run the both of them. Let's dive back in. The fact that I had the non-Steam version working just fine, and then randomly it wouldn't when I booted my PC up today, even though it was working fine yesterday. Very bizarre. It's very inconsistent behavior from it. On top of the random graphical glitches seen in Jane Nash. Here we go. See, it's doing it now. So yeah, this is the one where it's calculating all sorts of rigid body physics and collisions on the CPU, or a PPU if one was available. There we go, so that was the warm-up just to get the physics going. And there's a cone in the corner there that says, do you measure up on it? There we go, it did it this time. There's the texture filtering test, which ran extremely quickly, and that one which also ran extremely quickly. So these feature tests, some of them run insanely quickly, because I think they're based on frame rate timing. So the higher the frame rate, the faster they'll go, which means they fly by. This is the parallax occlusion mapping test, which looks really, really cool. It would look even better if the parallax occlusion mapping was of a higher sampling rate or resolution. But again, you have to remember, it's 2008. There's the cloth simulation test, which again looks like it's frame rate based. And there's a particle test, again, frame rate based. And there's, I believe, some Perlin noise tests, which isn't frame rate based. Which is strange. Some of these are, so some of these are frame rate based in that, the higher the frame rate, the quicker they'll go through. So unfortunately, some of those tests just absolutely fly by. And there we have the online 3DMark result browser, which still works to this day, even with 3DMark Vantage. I think probably because my anti-aliasing settings have been modified by the NVIDIA drivers, it's probably invalidated my score, and that's why I've got an overall score of 0. It also says my graphics score is 0 there as well. That's because I only ran the CPU tests and beyond, not the initial tests, just to see if I could get that CPU test to work. You can see all the details here, and it's pretty much on point. So what I'm going to do now is do another run and hope that it doesn't crash on the CPU tests here, and see if we can get a graphical score out of this. Alrighty, so after another run, we managed to make it all the way through this time without it crashing on the second CPU test, and we have a CPU score of 97,000, which is about a few hundred down from what it was the last run, so probably margin of error, and 126,000 on the graphics score, and a total now of 117,438 future mark points. This score is of course better than 99% of all results. Yeah, it makes sense, because I imagine people haven't tested this with modern hardware in probably a decade. So you can see the comparisons here: an Office PC 2013, a gaming laptop from 2013, gaming PC, Oculus Rift Min spec. You know, it's far above that, because obviously Oculus Rift Min spec was mid 2010s sort of time. But it's probably not a legitimate result. It won't appear on the top scores anywhere, because it's been validated by the NVIDIA driver settings for anti-aliasing. So yeah, that's really interesting. Really interesting to see how that runs. What was missing on this version of 3DMark? Yeah, not having the demos. A real sad thing to see that they got rid of that, and having a white paper that wasn't so fleshed out. I also noticed that the previous test I ran was with the default settings, which was not 4K, but very much the sort of standard settings that you'd run Vantage on to do a one-to-one performance test on. and that gives you a full score, whereas when you adjust the settings and turn it to extreme and put it on 4K, it then gives you a total score of 0. Could be because it's custom settings. I'm guessing that's why it said P before the points on the previous one, because it was at performance, and now it's on C custom and gives me 0 points, which means it's non-comparable. But even then, you still get a pretty high graphics score, 48,000, and a very similar CPU score. So that was 3DMark Vantage. As I said, no demo this time, which is a real shame, but hopefully next week we can return to form with 3DMark 11. I really like new Calico. I'm just quite disappointed in the lack of options and the lack of overall graphical tests. The feature tests are a bit wonky, and the CPU and CPU based physics tests and AI tests are a bit wonky, and even just running the actual application itself can be a bit strange. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think of 3DMark Vantage. Leave a like if you liked it, leave a comment, let me know what you think. Do subscribe for future videos on 3DMark, tech videos overall, and tech projects. There's a video out every week. Hope everyone's staying safe, and I will see you in the next video.